Hey there. I have another tapping ramble for you guys, except this time it's kind of the opposite from last time. In the last video, I wanted to tap on the lip balm container. I don't know where it went. And I didn't know what I was going to ramble about. In this one, I know what I'm going to ramble about, and I just decided to tap on this because I needed something to tap on. But in this video, I'm going to be rambling about HDR. I think I mentioned in a few videos ago when this happened. I can't remember though, so maybe I didn't. But I'm pretty sure I mentioned about how I had recently purchased an HDR monitor because I wanted to see about getting into uploading my videos in HDR. Just as kind of an interesting experiment. I haven't started doing that on my channel because, as it turns out, HDR is actually really complicated. And it just takes a lot of tweaking to get right. But just recently, I reconfigured my whole PC setup. Reconfigured as in I just rearranged things. I didn't really get anything new except for the monitor. But like I said, I got that a month ago at this point. Previously, I had been using, I have it right here. It's really dusty. I don't dust off my monitors very much, apparently. But I had been using this monitor. I actually have two of them. It is a super cheap, really shitty Acer monitor. It's 1600 by 900, so it isn't even full HD. It really isn't that much better than 720. And it's pretty small. I think it's 21 inches. I'm not exactly sure, though, to be honest. I have a tape measure somewhere, but whatever. It's pretty small. I had been using, I've had these for, I think, close to 15 years. Maybe even slightly more than 15 years. They're very old. They work, which was the main reason I'd been using them. But I recently decided, whatever. I have my new monitor that I just got, and I have a slightly older but still much newer than this monitor that I've also been using for quite a while. And I was like, you know what, I'm just going to phase out the old one. Fully embrace the new monitors, even though it'll mean having less monitor space, because with this one, originally I was using two of these, the really shitty ones, plus the slightly newer one that I have. So I had three monitors. And then when I got my HDR monitor, for some reason I thought, why not use all four? So for a little while there I was using four, but then I was like, this is just not working. So I phased out the two really shitty monitors. So now I'm just using the two much better ones. And lo and behold, it's been a much better experience. So as a sort of side note, having more monitors is not always better. At this point, I have fewer monitors, but the experience of using my computer is significantly improved. Anyway, it's not really the point of everything. The point is that my new monitor is HDR capable, which for every monitor is going to mean something a little bit different, right? The big difference is that it's OLED rather than LCD, which all of my other monitors are. When it comes to HDR, as I've been looking into it lately, because like I said, I've been looking into making HDR content for YouTube. Like I said, it's every company has their own standard, and the definition is very ambiguous especially for consumer grade products. When you're talking about true HDR, monitors that are going to be used for like color grading, cinema level productions. If you want to say that like that's true HDR, which arguably it is, those monitors are like hundreds of thousands of dollars, so a little bit outside my price range, For most consumer end products, pretty much any OLED is technically classified as HDR, because all HDR means is that you have a high contrast between the brightest pixels on the screen and the darkest pixels on the screen. The reason LCD isn't really capable of HDR is because rather than each pixel being self-illuminating, it uses a back panel, so that means that the darkest areas of the screen will be affected by the brightest areas, and there will be some bleed there, right? But there are plenty of other factors that, factor into how good an HDR experience is with an OLED monitor. So, for instance, like the peak brightness of the monitor, which is usually denoted in like nits, will affect the experience, because that just represents how bright the screen, kind of hit the microphone there, how bright the screen can get in the first place. So if you had an OLED monitor that couldn't get that bright, I don't really know that anyone makes those, but maybe they're a thing, I don't know. Because the high contrast is kind of the whole point. And I feel like you really don't need an OLED that is that bright in order to get the effect. But theoretically, if you had an OLED that was not capable of getting that bright, then you would have a slightly less, HDR experience, Just because the variance of like zero brightness, so pure black, and 100% brightness, pure white, would be different. So like if you're talking like 500 nits is your peak brightness, which again, I don't even know if they make monitors that only have that level of brightness, but maybe they do. That difference, that variance, the range is much smaller than a monitor that can reach 1,000 nits or 2,000 nits or whatever, I think 1,000 nits is pretty typical. That's what my monitor does, I'm pretty sure. But yeah. Anyway, when I got my monitor, which like I said was like a month ago or so, because I have my Xbox and my PC hooked up to like the same setup, basically. I use the same monitors. It's just I switch between the inputs when I am gaming versus using my PC. So when I got my new monitor, I just, out of interest, hooked it up to my Xbox to see what the games would look like. And I didn't really give it a good, honest, test, I guess. And like I said, when I first got the monitor, I was doing weird stuff where I was trying to use all four at the same time, and it was just kind of a mess. So I opted to leave my setup mostly the same and was using one of my older monitors for the Xbox. But since I just recently rearranged everything, I decided that I'd give it another shot. Just maybe I didn't give it the true college try. And I have to say, it's pretty crazy, honestly, when you actually, you do have to, calibrate it and stuff, and I didn't do that originally. It takes a bit of time, and it's not as immediately, car going by, it isn't as immediately, accessible. It does take a bit of tweaking to get, the most out of it, which is a little bit annoying, but when it works really well. That's the thing, too. I think maybe that's the reason why I didn't immediately notice it at first. It just got dark. When I first tested it out, when I first got the monitor, because I've noticed that, 50% of the time, maybe even slightly more than 50% of the time, the experience on the HDR monitor is really not all that different than on a typical monitor. So for instance, I've been playing a lot of Red Dead Redemption 2 lately, because that game just looks phenomenal. And it's a good game. So like in that game, if you're just like riding around the open plains in broad daylight, on both screens, it's going to look pretty much the same, because the whole concept of HDR, high dynamic range, is the idea that the screen is capable of displaying a wide range of contrast. So if your scene is pretty, broadly illuminated to the same degree, you're not really going to notice the HDR effect. And honestly, it really won't be exhibiting much of an HDR effect in the first place. Arguably, the screen is capable of being brighter, so the image it's displaying to you is brighter, but your eyes are going to focus to the brightness level of what it's seeing. So to your mind, to your experience, it should be pretty much the same. So there are plenty of instances where the HDR really doesn't add much to the experience. It's pretty much exactly comparable. Now, my new monitor, and this is probably true of any higher end like gaming monitor, my newer monitor is like more color accurate, and it's capable of displaying like greater saturation. So I mean, in those cases, it is maybe slightly improved over just your typical like LCD or something. But honestly, you're probably not going to notice that all that much. And personally, I'm not a huge fan of when, a monitor tries to push its like color saturation super far just to like show that to you. So I have those settings usually toned down a good bit anyway. So for me, that's not super noticeable. But in those, I mean, to say they're rare is honestly maybe a bit of an overstatement. I would say they're somewhat common. But when it happens, when you get that scene, when you're in the game, and there's that moment where you're like in a building and you're looking out into the world, or it's at nighttime and you have like the lights of like Saint Denis. When you have that contrast, or like when you're riding your horse through the forest, so it's broad daylight, but there's plenty of shadows, and then like the sun is shining through the leaves and it illuminates the ground with like very hot spots. In those moments, it looks insane. It looks incredible. It looks like almost more real than real life. It's really weird. But it's very cool. It's a very cool experience. Unfortunately, it's not a perfect experience, so I guess while I'm gushing over it, I might as well not completely sugarcoat it, right? I have noticed this happens with any, it's mostly noticeable. I mean, it happens across the board, but it's mostly noticeable on like large swaths of gradients, right? So like the sky, for instance, I've noticed when it displays the sky, there is some color banding, which doesn't happen in SDR mode, which is a bit strange. Because like the whole idea of HDR is that it's usually using a wider color gamut, so it's able to represent more colors on screen, which should in theory eliminate color banding because it's able to gradiate the colors more successfully. So it is weird to me that there is more color banding. I don't know. Maybe this monitor is just, I mean, like I said, every HDR monitor, every OLED is going to be slightly different. This one is far from being like top of the line. It's pretty middle of the road. So maybe that's just a quirk of this particular monitor, I'm not sure. But it's easy enough to ignore. and it doesn't bother me enough to make the other experiences, like I said, when you're in that moment where you've got that light and you've got that dark and the contrast is just insane. That more than makes up for the slight color banding that you might notice from time to time. Another thing I've noticed, this monitor I have is capable of, I think, 144 hertz, although I think Xbox is only capable of outputting 120. I've never had higher than 60 hertz for a monitor. All of my other monitors are 60 hertz caps. And there are people that say that, you know, there's no difference between 30 FPS and 60 FPS. Those people are crazy. But I'll admit that while I think those people are crazy, for the longest time I always kind of figured that you didn't really need to go higher than 60. And maybe that's true still. Maybe I still kind of believe that. But I guess my belief in that stemmed mostly from the idea that, like, there were no, like, appreciable gains. But like I said, this monitor can do 120, and some games on Xbox do support 120. And it's a bigger difference than I was expecting. I talked about in my GTA 6 video about how the game will probably run at 30 frames per second. And in that video, I talked about how the 30 frames per second mode in GTA 5 is like really sluggish and, in my opinion, unplayable. And as like a conjunction to that, I guess, I don't know. I was talking about how when you go from playing a 60 FPS game to playing a 30 FPS game, it's very noticeable. But if you play that 30 FPS game for a while, or if you just start playing with that 30 FPS game, I'd argue that it's a lot less noticeable. You do get used to it, even though it is less than optimal, in my opinion. Even now, after having experienced 120 FPS, I still think 60 should be the bar across the board. If developers want to support a higher frame rate, specifically for console, obviously PC is always going to be uncapped, but if developers want to support a higher frame rate, they're obviously welcome to, but I think every developer should shoot for 60 frames per second. But that being said, I was extremely surprised that as a person who's always played games at 60, at least for like the past, 5 to 10 years, when 60 has become a lot more of the norm, right? I was surprised to find that when I played at 120, not only could I notice a difference, but when I went back to the 60 FPS mode, 60 FPS suddenly felt very jittery. In kind of the same way that going from 60 to 30 feels very jittery, going from 120 to 60 felt jittery, which was just weird to me because it's like 60 should be smooth. Like this is what I've always played at. This should feel smooth. Now again, I think that had mostly just to do with like the immediate comparison in your mind, where it's like I can play a game at 60 FPS no problem. It's perfectly adequate in terms of smoothness. But it was just surprising and unexpected to have that comparison be made, where it was like suddenly 60 starts to feel a little less smooth when you've been playing at 120. But yeah, it's cool. One of my other big hesitations when it came to switching to this new monitor I have is that it's slightly smaller than the monitor I had been using. So the monitor I had been using is this very large 32-inch LCD monitor. The OLED that I have now I think is 28 inches. So that doesn't sound that much smaller, but because it's measured on the diagonal, it is significantly smaller. So I was hesitant to switch to that for gaming because I was like, I want the big screen for gaming. But honestly, at this point, I'm really glad I made the switch because honestly, you really don't notice the size, I feel like, all that much. I mean, I not that there's no benefit to using a larger screen. I just feel like you reach a point of diminishing returns. You know, going from a monitor like this big to like something actually usable, you'll certainly notice a big difference, right? So if you're like, you know, like a Switch gamer and you go from the handheld to like a TV, right? You'll notice that. But going from 32 to 28, I really don't notice much of a difference in like the amount of field of view that the screen takes up in my eyes, you know. But I absolutely notice the difference in like color accuracy and dynamic range. So I definitely think it's worth it at this point. The 120 FPS modes are cool, but honestly I don't know that I'm going to use them all that much. That's more of a competitive gaming type of thing. And the problem is that I feel like with a lot of games, in order to achieve the 120 frames per second, they either reduce the resolution or reduce like the quality of the in-game assets. And call me silly, to each their own. I'm a graphics type of guy. I can appreciate the graphics of a well-made game, and I don't necessarily want to sacrifice that for 120, especially when it's, you know, we're talking 60 versus 120. If it was a case of, you know, 30 versus 60, like I said, with GTA 5, I will absolutely make that sacrifice because the 30 FPS mode is unplayable, even though it does look better. But yeah, when it's 60 versus 120, I'm perfectly fine with 60, so I'm probably just going to stick to 60 with most of my games. But who knows? I mean, it seems like different games handle it differently and are more or less optimized for 120. So, for instance, the 2 games, well, I guess 3 games that I have that do 120 are Call of Duty, Apex Legends, and then Rocket League. And with Call of Duty, I couldn't really notice much of a change at all in the visual fidelity. So in that game, maybe the 120 doesn't make much of a difference. In Apex Legends, it made a pretty massive difference. They are clearly rendering the game at a much lower resolution when you have 120 FPS selected. And then with Rocket League, also surprisingly, was kind of the same thing, where the resolution clearly gets dropped. Rocket League is surprising simply because that game is so simple. I really feel like there shouldn't be much of an issue rendering that game at a high resolution and a high frame rate. But I don't know. I'm not a game developer, so who knows. But I mean, it's weird for the difference between like Call of Duty and Apex is also weird because Apex is considerably less graphically demanding, I would argue, than Call of Duty. Apex Legends has much simpler geometry, much lower resolution textures. It's not nearly as detailed. The lighting model is not as detailed. I guess Call of Duty just has more resources to optimize that sort of stuff, but yeah, I don't know. Like I said, when it comes to 120, I can take it or leave it. But I have been having fun playing Red Dead Redemption, which unfortunately runs at 30 frames per second, but like I said, you get used to it. But I've been having fun playing that in HDR. It's a really good looking game. It's also getting me excited for GTA 6, which is going to look even better. And that's going to look insane in HDR. But yeah, I think that's probably going to do it for this video. If you guys have any experience with HDR versus non-HDR, I mean, most of you are probably watching this on a somewhat recently released smartphone. Most of those nowadays have HDR, I think. I mean, any phone made past like, I don't know, like 2017, I think is going to be HDR compatible. So technically, you'll probably have had some experience with HDR using your phone. But yeah, just let me know what you think. If you've had a similar experience, I'd be curious to know. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching and listening. And I will catch you later.